Welcome to Adopting Zero Trust, an independent podcast. Our hosts, Elliot Volkman and Neil Dennis, will have transparent and open conversations with the people driving modern security approaches forward, while leaving vendor hype behind. It's time to remove implicit trust and buzzwords and get to the root of the movement.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Adopting Zero Trust, or AZT. My name is Elliot Volkman, your producer, alongside Neil Dennis, our host. And Tyler is going to be here talking about a subject that we have somehow neglected to cover in this equation, which is as basic as it gets when it comes to a zero trust strategy. So to ensure that I don't mess up your background and important brand names and whatnot, Tyler, maybe you can give us a little bit of a background on yourself and how you got into your shoes today.
Sure. So I'm a senior manager of security research at Fortra. I've been in the vulnerability management space now for 18 years. And through a series of acquisitions, I still work with the same product I started working with 18 years ago, which is an odd thing, I think, to encounter in that industry. People usually move from time to time, but we were Encircle, we were Tripwire, Tripwire was acquired again. Now we're Fortra. My role has since expanded that I now look at vulnerability management across multiple products. I look at MDR and XDR a bit now, research. My love has always been vulnerabilities, vulnerability research. I started out as a teenager in the mid-90s playing with this stuff and sitting there on the Slackware box compiling old C exploits just to see what they would do. And I've just been in love with it ever since, and it hasn't changed since then. So thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk about this.
Yeah, absolutely. Likewise. And I can already see Neil grinning. You've definitely said some right terms there to perk his ears up. But you also said the key word, which is what we're going to be talking about today as it relates to modern cybersecurity strategies and, of course, zero trust, which is vulnerabilities, patching, the very most basic thing that somehow, again, we have neglected to talk about. So I'd love just to tee this off with a nice little softball. Maybe you can give us a little bit of perspective of in this whole world of zero trust, through the lens of we have to go under the notion that you're probably breached, or you have to run under the notion that you are already breached. How important and how critical is it to stay on top of patching?
It's interesting because vulnerability management, I don't talk a lot about zero trust. So I did a whole lot of reading to make sure I didn't sound like a fool, and I still probably will, but that's okay. And I was actually surprised to see a number of articles out there that said, zero trust means that you don't have to focus on patching with as much priority as you otherwise might have to. That surprised me. Now, again, I live and breathe the vulnerability management space, so it's something that is near and dear to my heart, and I consider it critical. But in my mind, yes, are you breached? When will you be breached? It's not a matter of if you'll be breached. It's a matter of when. And one of the easiest ways to stay on top of that is to stay on top of your patching. Know what's out there, know how to prioritize your risk, and know how to deal with everything that's coming at you. I think the biggest thing, and one of the coolest experiences I've had this year, if I can go on a bit of a tangent, is I'm involved with the Canadian Cyber Threat Exchange, CCTX. And one of the things that I've been doing there is actually running a vulnerability community of interest for Canadian companies. Every 2 weeks or so, we meet and talk. And one of the things that I found is that a lot of people really want to make their vulnerability management programs work. A lot of people are keen to see it work. They just don't know how to get to that point. And I think that I've rambled a lot, but I think that knowing how to properly prioritize things is really key to not just applying those patches and understanding them, but securing your overall environment, because you have limited resources and patching isn't the only thing you have to do. So knowing where to put your resources and how to use them and how to properly prioritize the overall security of your enterprise is probably the most important thing for people.
That is a fantastic question. And usually I would ask a follow-up, but you also hit another term, which is basically the collective defense. So for the US, we have ISACs. And for anyone that's listened, probably knows that Neil has a strong love affair or interest with ISAC. So I'm going to actually just hand that off right over to you, Neil. Maybe you can go there because I don't want to hold you back. And I feel like I can just feel you're ready to go.
I just find it's always fun when day-to-day life syncs up with podcast life in one way or another. And Tyler, for you're not rambling. I'm going to teach you how rambling works here in a few seconds. That being said, CCTX is someone I work with as well from a product perspective. So in my day life, my day job, they use one of our products to impact that membership from a portal and collaboration perspective. So we'll talk about that maybe offline as far as what that is a little bit more. So that's pretty cool. Now, the one thing I want to maybe highlight real fast before I ask a couple of questions, I want to make sure people understand that zero trust policy and procedure isn't obviously saying don't patch or de-escalate or deprioritize or don't make it an important thing. It's more of let's look at what types of vulnerabilities are typically taken advantage of, especially things like remote execution stuff related type things. And what happens once that is exploited? How does the pivot occur, and why does the pivot occur? I can get into a server with some exploit, right? With some RCE, but once I'm there, if you have the right zero trust policies, then you should really still just be there in theory, minus additional exploitation paths that aren't patched or available. I think for the listeners, just understanding that, criticality and understanding your prioritization still needs to happen at a very base level, but there is some leniency towards what happens once the exploit is taken advantage of for what that threat actor has as a next step if you've taken due process around a zero trust implementation. And any time on a server is still bad time on a server if it's from a threat actor, no matter what you've done to block down the rest of it. So then, that in mind, thinking about the chain of impact and stuff of that, we see old talks around security and security and layers, defense and depth. Make it like an onion. Prioritize your things based off of either the lowest common denominator or the biggest impact, whatever, blah, 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 words. So from your perspective, thinking about what you've already gleaned, what would be some of the key advice to help maybe refocus prioritization, or what would you think would be impactful to still take into account to prioritize these data points? Should we focus on exclusively say, hey, zero trust behind the firewall is great, behind the gateway and DMZ is great, let's just go ahead and manage all the legitimate, blatantly internet-facing stuff because zero trust will take care of it all? Or should we still fully understand that an exploit's an exploit and it can still get around the zero trust framework?
Yeah, so I'm going to step back and say, one of the things I've seen is that there are degrees in everything. There are degrees in vulnerability management. There are degrees in zero trust. And I think that it depends on how far along you are in your implementation path in both of these things. If you're all the way there and you have a full zero trust network in place, yeah, it's going to help you a lot. But if you're in your infancy and just starting to implement zero trust in your environment, not going to necessarily help you as much as somebody who's made it to the end and crossed the finish line, if you can ever really cross the finish line in anything with tech. But when it comes to what do you prioritize and where do you look, I think there's two primary things that you tend to cross my mind. One is that publicly accessible stuff that you just have to deal with it. If we look at what's been going on in the last week, we saw the Palo Alto vulnerability, the Global Protect vulnerability. Cisco yesterday just dropped the Arcane Door, I think is what they called it, campaign. It's got 3 new CVEs that are impacting ASAs and FTD, Firepower Threat Defense. And I think that those are critical things that you have to look at, because those are systems that are sitting there with public IP addresses that anyone's going to be able to poke. The other thing, though, is your user base. And let's be honest, people are going to click links. The number of times forget the enterprise, the number of times that I've had family members and friends call me and say, oh, I got an email that said I had to pay a fee on a UPS shipment, and I clicked it and gave them my credit card, but I don't think it was real. Or I called tech support because I had a pop-up when I visited a website and it said I had to call them and they wanted to remote into my computer to fix stuff. Or people click these things all the time. And the same people that are my family and friends clicking these are people who are employees in enterprises and organizations. So you really need to think about that end user desktop, how it's sitting, what you can do with it, and what does that user have either on the desktop or what do they have access to? And start to assign asset values, right? Is this a critical server? Does this server have financial data on it? Because quite honestly, if you've got a server that's processing credit cards versus a server that's serving your static web page, I would say one is a little more important than the other at the end of the day. So I think taking asset values into account is really important. And I think thinking about those two spaces is really the critical things that you want to think about.
There's the mute button. So I think from a vulnerability management perspective, I think this is a fun exercise where if you're doing those types of assessment, I think those types of assessments, let me backstep. If your vulnerability management team has done their job or is doing their job and they understand the infrastructure, at least at some significance to understand the prioritization impact, I think that's also potentially your list for prioritizing what you should start doing when you're building out your zero trust policy and what infrastructure you should obviously look to start wrapping that around as you build your layers into that. So I don't know if that's an agree or disagree moment, but I would like to imagine that the things you prioritize from an update perspective are the ones you should obviously prioritize from securing to a new modality.
Makes perfect sense to me. Yeah.
Yeah. What I heard is I'm going to go harass you. You're going to have the prioritization because you're my vulnerability management guy on my team. And you're going to help me build my zero trust policy from that prioritization procedures that you've built already on my behalf. And I'm going to check the box with one less thing I have to do.
Nope, that makes sense to me. Then all we got to do is sit down and figure out how we're going to fit in whatever policing or benchmarking mechanism we're going to use, which I don't want to derail the conversation, but I just want to point out that way too many vulnerability management programs don't take security configuration management into account. They either treat it as two separate things. Like often SCM still lives with IT people, I find, and not always living with security and CIS benchmarks or disastigs or whatever policy you want. The number of policies, especially once you get into various governments implementing their own policy, there's so many out there that you might have to adhere to. Understanding which ones you because of regulatory reasons need to apply to or comply with, and which ones you should from a basic security hygiene standpoint. Once you apply those, the thing that I've always found really cool is that yes, vulnerabilities are a concern, but there are things that prevent the risk of exploitation from either occurring or minimize the risk of exploitation happening. Zero trust is obviously one of those. You can try and prevent pivoting around the network, hopefully restrict them down to a single system. But if you go a step further and you've got a properly applied configuration on the box is securely locked down with again, I'm going to go with CIS benchmarks because I think they're the most well-known. But every time I say CIS, just know I'm just using a generic term. If you lock them all down and use the full CIS policies and you implement level 1, level 2 of those policies, you end up with a relatively secure box in a lot of other ways as well. So you can have your zero trust network. Now you've got your hardened device, and now patching your vulnerabilities is just one more layer that you're adding on top of that. And so I think it's really about putting all those together. And to your point about defense in depth and layering the onion, I'll go with a different one. I hope I'm still here. It said trying to reconnect, but I'll go with a different one and say that it's almost like you're building a lasagna. Again, I'm a big guy. I love my food, but yeah, you get that base down first, and then it's just about stacking those layers on top of each other to get to a point where you secure yourself as much as possible.
And nothing wrong with a good lasagna. My family's part Italian on my mama's side, so that's a great analogy for my stomach. I know I don't look it, but yeah, there's a lot of lasagna packed away behind these layers. No, so you're talking about some of the benchmark items here, and you come back to CIS, and just because familiarity or possibility, like you mentioned, you think that's a good standard. Are there, out of the host of standards and process flows, CIS being one of, are there other recommendations or other things that people should look into if they're just really getting started from that consideration? Echelons and things that you would suggest to go poke and prod so they can get a better understanding of where they really should be from those benchmark standards?
So I think I like CIS and I like talking about CIS because it's almost like entry level, like it's table stakes. You want to get in there, and the fact that they break it into, so if you're not familiar with the benchmarks, they break it into various levels. And here's the things that everyone should do. Here's the things that you should do if you're a bigger organization with a security team. And here's the things that you should do if you're like a nation state target type levels. And so that first one, that table stakes level 1 stuff, is simple. It should not take a lot of effort on the part of an organization to implement it. So that's why I like talking about it, because it really is table stakes. Now, when you want to move forward from there, I think it's important to think about who you are as a business. And that's where I think the regulatory policies start to come into play. If you're doing business with the government, DISA stakes are going to be very important to you, and you better know your stakes and what they contain. If you are payment card stuff, PCI obviously is the standard you want to pay attention to. So I think that NERC-CIP for energy, that's a big one. Obviously, energy companies, I think was it last week, the FBI issued another warning about potential nation state attacks coming in against infrastructure. Those are all big ones, but I think really when we're talking about the security configuration management space anyway, I do think that CIS is just where you start and then just build from there based on the vertical that you find your organization in.
Yeah, that makes sense. So shifting slightly back into collective defense and CCTX a little bit. So you talk about your participation there in that community and your involvement within that particular group. So thinking once again about a little bit about standards and impact and what that means. Are you finding that in this particular community, and this isn't to call out the efficacy or quality, but just in general, in a community perspective, are you finding that these types of discussions are taking place in a good light and having good interactions? Or are you finding that there's still people coming along and, maybe I'll talk with you about it or not? Or is there good involvement from the community at large when you offer up these chats?
Yeah, we've been a member of CCTX for a while. I didn't originally attend the meetings, and I started attending them last year sometime. And I think the first thing that stood out to me, and I hope it's the same for all the other ICE that exist, that they're all like this because it's phenomenal, is one, first of all and foremost, and I just want to give a shout out to the people that run CCTX, the commitment and care that they put into it and the number of new programs and features that they start up to try and get the community collaborating is just phenomenal. For example, giving me the space to run a vulnerability community of interest and bring together like-minded individuals from across Canada to talk about it. And the participation in those has been absolutely fantastic. If my answers don't give it away, I like to talk. So sometimes I worry about monopolizing the time at these sessions, but luckily they go the full hour-long meeting every second Friday for that one with almost no silence. We have our weekly Wednesday meetings that CCTX runs. Same thing. Those are amazing. The level of sharing and communication and question asking that happens really impresses me. I enjoy it a lot. I've learned a lot, and I think there's a lot of really cool things that come out of those types of sharing situations. And I think anyone who's Canada or not in Canada, but maybe you're in financial and FSISEC is an option to you or something, or maybe you're a government in the US and you can get into the multi-state ISEC or something. I think there's lots of options out there. And if you have these things available to you, you definitely should be taking advantage of them, because the amount of intelligence you can glean from them is way more than you'll ever accomplish on your own.
Amen. I am fighting hard, Elliot, to not turn this into a collective defense podcast.
I mean, go for it. It's yours to take.
But, and we'll bring it back around, but Rob, Rick, and Gina over there at CCTX, I'm not sure who else. Well, they're not really that big of a team, but they do a lot of amazing things with the limited amount of people that they have running that type of organization. And I think to iterate on this a little bit, the way a community like this becomes impactful is because members take the opportunity to become involved in the resources and the opportunities that these communities are presenting. Without member engagement, without members coming to these meetings, openly discussing things, and let's be fair, it's the Canadian meetup, so nobody's going to tell you to be quiet. They're too polite. But getting engaged, having these discussions is what makes those communities at large impactful. If you just show up, or for that matter, never show up, but you sign up for a membership and you're like, give me a feed and I'll call it a day. Good luck in 5 years or less, because if too many people do that, then there's no quality, because these smaller communities or these smaller management groups with these bigger communities aren't able to go out and effectively research every nitty gritty thing on their own to impact their membership, especially in a community like CCTX, which is a diverse pool of people. It's not just one focal point. So engagement and involvement in the communities that you're in, ISACs, ISAOs, CCTX, private sharing communities, whatever they are, trust groups, has to happen for that community to continue to move forward. And so it's people like Tyler here that obviously make that an impact for those communities. So you may say good things about CCTX, but I guarantee you they're way more happy to have you there than in general, because of what you're doing within the community. So that being said, to bring it back after my little rant and soapbox moment, get your butt involved in an ISAC, ISAO, trust group, something like that. And if you happen to be in the right industry verticals, get involved in multiple. They'll pay dividends the more you give back into them. But the last piece, back on policy, procedure, vulnerability management, things like that. The other thing I love about these, you have people like yourself that are in these communities that have this breadth of knowledge where I can solicit some kind of request for information or a survey or just a phone call in a group meeting, right? And ask these questions like we're talking about here. Hey, what's your take on CIS for a benchmark? And just like I can get that from you in those communities. And my ability to grow moves beyond my own four walls, because now I've got your wonderful expertise to help me. And so taking advantage of that. So anybody who's listening to this that's in CCTX, whenever the next call is, you got your vulnerability management guy here, go harass them. He's got wonderful stuff to share. Now, flipping this around a little bit and hopefully trying to get us back on track.
I don't think we'll ever get there.
No, we're not. We are way out. When we think about, so we talked about benchmarks and the standards a little bit, CIS table stakes, and obviously thinking about your industry vertical to grow this. And we think about prioritization within the aspects of what's available, and then maybe taking that to hopefully leverage that to prioritize your zero trust adoption policy and where you need to go. What other kind of tidbits? So we think about those two big key aspects. What's something else that maybe we should consider along this journey, even if it's just more pure vulnerability management play, to remind people again of key aspects here as they grow into that maturation cycle?
I feel like that was like a softball to cue up me saying CVSS, but I'm not sure I want to say CVSS. One of the things that I think CVSS has done a good job of spelling out finally is that it is not a risk prioritization methodology. It is about talking about the severity of the vulnerability in context of every other vulnerability. It doesn't tell you the risk behind it. And I think that's something a lot of people get wrong. A lot of people want to take CVSS and immediately say, this represents the risk. It doesn't. And so they've got that text in their documentation. So I think CVSS is one of those things that you just have to use at this point. Everyone uses it as a standard. Doesn't matter if you go to a Cisco page, a Microsoft page, if you go to NIST and look at NVD, CVSS is there. It's something that we use. It's something that we can make comparisons with, if nothing else, when we talk about vulnerability, again, severity, not risk. We have CVSS v4 out now. If you haven't read it or looked at it, it does make improvements, but also adds complexity over past versions. Also removes some complexity. Thankfully, no more scope, although I have issues with the use of the word penultimate in there. If you go read the entire standard and see penultimate, it appears that whoever wrote it thought it meant last and not second to last. So the penultimate provider is who should be giving criticality in some cases, and that seems odd to me. I think whoever is at the end of the chain providing it is probably who should really do that. So that's really my only complaint, I think, with V4. I think V4 is a huge improvement otherwise over previous versions. And so it's nice to see some people start to adopt it. I find the problem, and we ran into this problem when we went from V2 to V3, and now we have the problem with V3 to V4, is different organizations are using different versions. And so we're getting adoption rates that are widely varied. And I just said, and now I'm going to contradict myself, CVSS is great because you can use it to do those apples to oranges comparisons because you have something that's standard. But when you have somebody who's using 3 and you have somebody who's using, or 3.1, I should say, and somebody who's using 4, you can't do that severity comparison as easily. Yes, it's useful. Yes, use it. Do not consider it a measure of risk, and keep in mind that your vendors may not be using the same versions, and you need to take that into account. I think the thing to really think about when you're talking about vulnerability is the source of information and who's telling you that it's important. There are in the vendor space who benefit from hyping a vulnerability, giving it a name, giving it a logo, making a web page for it, and putting out a big press release that the sky is falling when maybe it's not, is just financially beneficial to them. There are media organizations that are happy to pick up and run with vulnerabilities, even if they aren't the biggest thing in the world. And then you get something that makes the news, something that your boss sees because it was in a headline in some article somewhere, or it was on the 6 o'clock news last night. And they want to know what you're doing about that. And they want to shift all their resources into that because they saw it on the news. But it may not be the most critical thing for your environment. It may not be the most impactful thing for you. And I like to call it media hype. I like to talk about media hype vulnerabilities. I think that that's something that you have to be aware of when you're prioritizing what you're fixing. And it's something you have to have a good answer about when you do have your leadership come to you with something that you know is being hyped by the media, but maybe isn't as critical as 3 or 4 other things that have come across your desk. Know who your vendors are in your environment and know what they're saying about their own vulnerabilities. I think that's important. Now, do some vendors try to downplay their vulnerabilities? Of course they do. Anybody who's followed loopback to CVSS, Oracle once upon a time modified CVSS because they didn't want to use complete when they were talking about a database compromise because it wasn't a full OS compromise. So they implemented their own in-between partial and complete for CIA called Partial Plus, which allowed them to downgrade what would have been complete to Partial Plus, Partial Plus, Partial Plus. So vendors definitely do that too. But at least your vendor is going to be able to tell you, hey, the sky is falling. This is something we want you to fix right now. If your vendor's not screaming at you, they're not sending you alerts, there's a chance that maybe the media got it wrong, because I know that a lot of companies out there, when they think something is serious, they will yell at you. They'll say, hey, fix this right away. It's a big deal. And again, I think we're seeing that right now with the Cisco one, and the fact that we've got a massive Talos blog post out covering all the details about it. It's got all the IOCs in it. They've done a great job there. And we've got patches out for at least the known vulnerabilities. The initial attack vector is still unknown, so there's still some risk there, but they're putting it out there, being open about it and presenting it. And I think that's a really good thing to see from a vendor. I think that's a great example other vendors can take away. And it's a way to develop a lot of trust in the vulnerability management process. Is if you can sit there and see that your vendor is sharing all this information with you, that's a huge win.
And Cisco obviously has a wonderfully new shiny penny for log management services, so they should be able to see more stuff. Yeah, I think that's awesome, because literally just +1 the whole entire fact about what we talked about from a vendor trust relationship. Because as an Intel analyst, which the approach you just described on how to manage that data to make it intelligent for you at a base layer, that's Intel 101 in an organization. When you consume something from a third-party source, I don't care what they label it, I don't care what the feed is called, unless it is purposely curated for your environment by that vendor, and they know you and they're doing this for you kind of thing. That is not intelligence, that is data. And it's the same thing with these, with the CVSS, it's the same thing with the vulnerability pages, things like that. I don't go and consume every IP hash or MITRE framework, fingerprint, TTP, YARA, whatever it is I'm getting from all of my sources. I have to prioritize them. I have to rack and stack those things to make them actually intelligent for my environment. And I think for you, talking about vendor trust and relationships around that's a great way to start. But the vendor obviously is telling you, hey, you're screwed, do it now, do it. But if you've got in a lot of corporate networks and a lot of larger enterprises, they're looking at 600-700 minimum sources of software and product that they have in their environment at a minimum. So that supply chain aspect of things. And there's things that are echelon down, like SolarWinds was for people. SolarWinds, big freaking company, but most people didn't know they had it. And this goes back to understand your environment, understand what your company's priorities are to keep the dollars and the lights on. And then you rack and stack from top to bottom what that is. And then hopefully you understand your bill of materials for those key resources. And then you can maybe start building that relationship with the vendor, depending on the scale of your company, or at least some awareness within what that factor is. But to your point, there's crap. It's all crap until you've been proven otherwise. And don't just take everything for what the third party says it is. Make it intelligent for you. And then hopefully you won't have to get up at Saturday at 3 a.m. after having a wonderful binger on Friday night to hear your CISO yell at you because you read some news article on Ars Technica.
I think you put that much more succinctly than I did.
Well, like I said, from an Intel analyst perspective, you literally mirrored the life of an Intel analyst, but from that vulnerability aspect. So I love it. I think it's awesome. I think it's hilarious as well as awesome that you've considered that and obviously deal with that as makes sense, like you should. And it's just the parallels between my life and your life in those same veins is about the same, because you'd get a phone call as a vulnerability management guy when that Ars Technica blog comes out at 3 a.m. But the Intel guy is also getting a phone call to talk about who is actively doing X, Y, and Z while you're getting told to go fix it.
Yep.
And then,
or rate coverage for it as we do. Yes.
Yeah.
Which is, we haven't talked about. You talked about you can't turn on all of your feeds and you can't take every Yara rule you're sent and everything you're given. And I just thought about the fact that, that's one of the big things. People don't give enough thought to the false positives that you start to generate when you turn on everything and you just take everything and you just throw all the noise out there. And being in that space and watching, that's what my team does, right? Is we ship the content that powers a VM tool. That's what we've done that's what got me into this, was starting to write content that powered a VM tool 18 years ago. I've spent a lot of time and seen a lot of changes over time in how you go from something that is quote unquote false positive prone to a direct condition test. And I don't want to name the software, but there's one example that I absolutely love. And this is just going to be a pure vulnerability thing, but anecdotally, I find it fascinating. Back in 2014, a product from a very large 2-letter company had a vulnerability in it that allowed anyone who could communicate with an open port that was just listening by default to execute commands on the host. It was just there. It wasn't technically a vulnerability because it was a feature that they had put in the product. So it came to light, came to the attention of other people. People started exploiting it. Exploits showed up in all the popular exploit frameworks for it. It was very easy to take advantage of. And it was, and I'm going to do air quotes, patched. There we go. I have to get them into the frame. But what they really did is they introduced an option to turn it off. So fast forward, that was 2014. I just had a conversation with somebody who installed the 2023 version of this software. And we reported this 2014 CVE on it. And they said, this is impossible. This is a false positive. And I said, it can't be a false positive. It's a direct condition test. We're actually testing to see if that vulnerability exists. So we ended up getting the software, installing it, and sure enough, could exploit it. That checkbox is still there to disable the setting, but it is still enabled by default on the latest version of the software. And so I guess that's an example of where vendor trust doesn't work. But I think it's a great example of how you have to know the type of content that you're turning on and running, and know if it is something that is, in the VM world, there used to be this term of banner check. Is it a banner check, or is it something that's actually testing the condition? Because you can alleviate a lot of your stress, a lot of your pain points, and a lot of your back and forth with either your operations team that's involved with dealing with it or your vendor, by knowing sort of the fidelity of the check that you're dealing with. And so I think that's an important thing to throw out there too, that organizations need to think about, is how much can you trust your detection? And that's not just a VM problem, right? That same thing exists in the IDS world. It exists in the STM world. It exists anywhere that you have content or signatures or whatever other term you want to use coming from your vendor. The antivirus world, there's a Python library that I can't for the life of me install on my computer without turning off Windows Defender first. And it's a valid Python library, but Windows Defender wants to flag it and remove it every single time. So you do have to consider those things as well and make sure that you have a high level of confidence in whatever you're using for whatever method of detection you're performing.
I love the wonderful, it's not a bug, it's a feature response from product company. Now we meant to do that and break the product. So thinking a little far forward then on this. So vendor relations, supply chain, there's a whole 2 hours worth of a podcast just talking about supply chain risk mitigation and how to handle those and build those relations. And so for Elliot, maybe that's a fun one where we get a couple of, I think that'd be a fun one to have just someone working at a company vendor side of the house, a couple of people to talk about what they would like to see from their client base. That'd be a fun chat. That being said, I'm curious about your take on how often you see someone obviously push the patch but don't test the patch perspective, or how often someone should realize that when they push the patch, they should test the patch.
Yes. I like to call this the patch management versus vulnerability management debate, because those are two very different things. And I wish I could make more people realize that all the time. And I've got a few examples. I think the biggest one is we'll just say it, Microsoft in general. If you ever take a look at any Patch Tuesday, and I've taken a look at hundreds of them, then you'll know that there are always vulnerabilities that have post-patch configuration steps in order to fully remediate them. And I can't tell you the number of conversations that I've had over the years with people who WSUS rolls out the updates for them. Oh no, I pushed those updates. Look, the update is installed. That's great, but the update was step one. Did you then go in and apply this registry key that turns on this feature and this registry key that changes this value? And the answer is almost always no. So I think that's a huge one. The best one, and we got to go back in time a little bit for this, but IIS famously had an issue from Windows Server 2000 all the way up to about Server 2008-ish, where if you were on a service pack and let's say you installed Server 2003 and then you updated to Service Pack 1, you updated to Service Pack 2, Service Pack 2 initially, you then turned on IIS. It would grab those core unpatched IIS files that had come with the installation. It didn't have the replacement Service Pack ones on it. So you could be running Server 2003, Service Pack 2, but your IIS was actually at the non-Service Pack level. And so all those IIS vulnerabilities still existed. And so we dealt with dozens of customers who would come to us and be like, no, I'm running Service Pack 2. This vulnerability says it doesn't apply to Service Pack 2. But you ended up in this weird state where the Service Pack was half unapplied. But because you never tested it, you never even looked to see, do I have the right files afterwards? I think, and I just suggested this, so you talked about great phone calls coming out of like CCTX and other organizations like that. I ended up spending an hour on the phone with another member of CCTX talking about VM and SDM just last week. And one of the things I pointed out, I think an overlooked feature of FIM, file integrity monitoring, is actually verifying that when you apply a patch, all your files get replaced properly, because that's what a patch usually does in the Windows world, is it updates files. If you apply a patch and you have no file changes on your system, you probably didn't apply that patch. Something to keep in mind. So I think there's lots of ways to validate. Often Windows makes it really easy for you. Did the file version increment? And often they make that available for you in file manifest. They're not as accurate. They went to the new patching method as they used to be. There's a lot of blank data in their manifest, but there are lists of file versions out there, and you can always check it yourself. Check the date, check the file version, check your FIM tool, test it, verify with a vulnerability management tool. There's lots of ways to test, but that is a huge problem of people not validating that a patch is properly applied. Everyone wants the, what was it called? Yeah, right? The set it and forget it approach of patching, and it's not that simple. You have to do follow-up.
No, that makes sense. I love it. And Elliot over here trying to chat with us while we're talking. Oh, yeah, fair play. I'm getting
I guess I'll just chime in. Yeah, We gotta give him the soft exit.
I'm going to call you out. No. So I actually don't think I have any other questions, to be fair. I think from a curiosity perspective, I have a rabbit hole that I want to talk to, but not on this call. But I will say for my part, I find it fascinating that you're part of CCTX and involved, and I love that. So thank you for doing your part to help that community and that engagement. And I'm going to probably be harassing you through Rob, Rick, and Gina, simply now that I know who you are. So be prepared.
I welcome it.
And then last but not least, I just iterate on once again that I think there's a lot of really cool kind of potential to leverage this type of teaming, the vulnerability management team and that crew to help build your zero trust policy from the ground up, right? Not just to include it as, hey, when should we patch, but like legitimately take advantage of the work that a team of Tyler's has done to understand the nuances of the infrastructure and understand how to keep from getting a phone call on Saturday morning. And I think those are key aspects that when going down the zero trust pipe, those are questions that you're hopefully asking and hopefully don't have to ask if you have that team already established, or at least not have to ask as many questions around it. So I think that to me is one of the biggest key takeaways from a pipeline procedural perspective. Obviously get you all involved. The sooner I can get someone like you involved at my organization, the less work I have to do to start the rack and stack part of that procedure potentially. So pretty cool.
Awesome.
I'll throw it back over to Elliot. And
All right. I've got one very short question, which I think you've sort of you talked about the why, but let's say hypothetically you're a strange introverted person and you're a little bit uncomfortable contributing and being part of these communities. What in your perspective would maybe ease people in? Because these things are established, they've been around for a while, but yeah, are there mechanisms in place? Or what is your general thought of like, how do you throw yourself in there and
join a
add
Canadian
value?
community for
I would say, and maybe I talk too much for this to come across. I like to call myself a very shy introvert. If you see me at RSA, I'm probably the person, not that I'm going, but if you see me at a conference, I'm the person standing in the corner, usually not speaking. I don't like to talk to strangers. I will talk forever if you start a conversation, but I don't want to introduce myself to you. And that's not that I don't want to, it's that I'm completely terrified of the idea of even considering that. And so for me, I started joining these calls and I sat in silence week after week after week, just listening. And I don't know when a switch flicked for me, but all of a sudden I was sitting there on a call and something came up and I was like, oh, I can talk. I know these people now. They had never heard my voice before, but I had listened to them talk so many times that I felt familiar with them. And I think the biggest thing to take away is that everyone at these groups is just looking to improve. They're just looking to better their organizations, the community itself, and you are part of that community. So if you can give back in any way, and that's how I look at it. I say I'm shy. I taught college for several years, developed a number of college courses in cybersecurity. And afterwards, when that ended, I still mentor. I've done some teaching for community, local teenagers on intro to programming and stuff. And all of that stuff is not because I want to do it, because I'm terrified every time I do it, but because I want to give back. And as somebody who's in my position, that is a very easy way for me to give back. Everyone's, oh, that's so great that you're mentoring these people. And I'm like, no, it's really easy because I know it all. I don't have to really do anything. I just get to have a conversation. And so if you're in an area where you're comfortable, everyone else wants to hear what you have to say. They're excited to hear what you have to say. So just take the opportunity to turn off the mute button and speak up, and it's going to foster amazing relationships. It's been incredible for me every step of the way.
I love that. That is very similar in nature to why we essentially built this podcast, plus to rag on really bad marketing and people abusing the zero trust time. If anything else, it's a easy networking opportunity. Obviously, I mean, you obviously have been basically in the same org for a long period of time, but there's a lot of movement. If nothing else, being able to connect with your peers and other organizations, there might be an open door for you somewhere down the road. So that certainly makes sense to me. But with that all said, it is at the end of the hour. It is the end of our time. But you have certainly covered some things that Neil was very interested in and light touches on the vulnerability side. So maybe we'll come back around for a round 2 for some of that. We'll build like a panel conversation. So Tyler, thank you so much for giving your perspective. If our listeners are still jiving along for this, definitely check out some of Tyler's work, because that your group publishes a good bit of stuff and a lot of research. I'm definitely well acquainted with some of the research that comes out of your org, and it generally is really impactful and top notch. So I'll throw that out there as well. So Tyler, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Appreciate
It was
you.
a lot of fun.
Thank you for joining AZT, an independent series. Your hosts have been Elliot Volkman and Neil Dennis. To learn more about Zero Trust, go to adoptingzerotrust.com, subscribe to our newsletter, or join our Slack community. Viewpoints expressed during the show do not reflect the brands, employers, or companies of our hosts, guests, or potential sponsors.